So this little method runs when your app first launches, right? And all of this stuff happens as we move down to the end of that method. So all of these different steps that your application goes through while it's launching, some people will say, why does it do that? Or here's another approach, like we were talking about the language file yesterday. There's 1,000 ways to start an app in terms of what it ought to do, how it loads the data and how it loads the first view and how it begins its kind of life as an app. This is just the way that I came up with that supports a large number of people at volume kind of trying to do the same thing. So this is the best attempt over years and years of experimenting and changing and trying and thousands of apps that I think is globally a really good approach to help us all. But that doesn't mean that there's not a different way to do it, or maybe even a better way to do it. Sometimes, depending on what your app's going to do, it might be more efficient or faster to change these steps around a little bit. It's hard for me to know that based on what your app's going to do. And so I've never been the person claiming this is the way an app should work. Just saying this way works really well, and we think if you stick with this approach, you'll be well off, especially if you're new. Right? The more advanced you get, the more fun it is to try to explore alternative ways to do, in essence, the same thing. But this is a good, wonderful way, if you've never done this before, to try to kind of get your app going. So we've all seen this config file. So this configuration data here, going back to that idea, you've got application information, and you've got an array of themes and tabs and menus and screens. We're not going to describe what this, in a technical sense, how this thing's configured right now. Going back to that idea that this might not be the best way for your app to work, right? Because it's impossible to say that this is the best way for a piece of software to work 100% of the time, all the time. There's no way to make that claim. That wouldn't be valid. I'm just saying that if you're going to make dozens and dozens of apps because you're a developer, and you do this all the time, or you're going to make tens of thousands of apps because you've got a website helping a lot of people, that we need a way to organize kind of the process and the structure and the flow, and a good way to do that would be maybe put all the rules into a file, one file, that's portable and move aroundable and shareable and flexible to kind of drive your app. That's why we have this configuration file. We don't have this configuration file because that's the best way to make an app. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that this is an approach to making software that I think is awesome after doing it a lot. That doesn't mean that it's the best way. So that's important to understand why this file even exists. Right? So does anybody want to take a shot at why this file exists in an app? I know it sounds like a simple question, but somebody, go ahead, Thomas. Why does this thing exist?
Well, I mean, like everything, all of the other plugins are linking to the JSON.
Okay.
So the JSON is telling all of the plugins to do certain things.
Okay,
that'd be my shot at it.
No, there's nothing wrong with that. So let's explore that idea for a second. How else might a screen, like let's take one of these plugins here, BT screen menu list right here, right? Let me pull this one out. We've got child items that are part of it. Let me just reorganize this so we can kind of see how it's laid out. So we've got a screen with an array of menu items. We in this room know that those are called child items. So on this particular menu item, I can just look at it right away and I know that there's one right here. And so you said that our plugin, which in this case is a BT screen menu list simple, is linked to the JSON. I'm trying to use your words, right? And then we set the nav bar title text to home, right? So if that's the case, and that's true, by the way, so this little piece of data right here tells our menu how to work. Cool. How else might we do that? If you were a developer and you'd never heard of BuzzTouch, and you want to set the menu nav bar title text, and you want to set the, I don't know, context menu, how else might you do it if you didn't have the config file?
You'd probably put it in a plugin itself.
Yeah.
Right, so you could find that file.
.m file.
Exactly, you could find the .m, and instead of loading one of these properties, let me find one of them, I don't know, the prevent all scrolling, for example, instead of loading that from the data, you can just hand type it.
Okay.
There'd be nothing wrong with that approach. It wouldn't be very flexible, right? If you had 10 menus on your list, they'd all work that way, unless you had 10 different class files. If you had menu list screen 1, menu list screen 2, menu list, right? And so there are approaches that we take. And this is an important concept because if you had 50 maps in your app, there wouldn't be anything technically wrong with having 50 class files, map1.m, map2.m, map3.m, but if they all shared similar functionality, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. But we see that all the time in development. People repeating the same tasks.
I duplicate like the iPad book that Chris developed, you know, for the book reading, and I have the one he did, and then I duplicated it with another name, so it would play the sound automatically.
Right.
The sound, so I had to
So you
duplicate.
have 2 or whatever, but you don't have 50.
No.
Right, so one of the common,
Some people
But
have
it's-
you have 50 different things.
menu plugin.
No,
Exactly.
the ship menu, I had to do
Exactly.
like 10, and now I have to, with the new updates, I have to.
Right, so
change them back.
technically they work that way, but after you do it and you understand how it works and you have some experience, you say, wait a minute, if I back up a little bit and look at that, there might be a better way to do this so that my project's smaller, let's all, and I'm just bringing up this point that the configuration data allows us to dynamically control certain rules around how this class file, I'm getting technical here, how it works, instead of making a new class file. Because think of the other way to do this. Instead of making a list of screens in JSON data in your control panel, think about the web page, the control panel online when it packages your app. Think about it just making a new class file for you for every screen. It could totally do that. And it would work just fine. And if you opened up home screen menu.m and looked at the nickname hard-coded in the file, and then your next screen, and you'd end up with a project with 80 class files in it. Right? It would work. But what happens now when you need to make a change to all the class files that are like, you begin to run into these problems. And so that's what the 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 early days were for us, was trying to discover that, wait a minute, this is maybe a better way. So this evolved from all these problems that we ran into. But if you made a typo in one of them, and you needed to fix that, it just makes a lot more sense when you extend these classes in a flexible way with this data file. Anyway, I wanted to make sure that we all agreed and understood that this file's, in the world of iPhone developing, not required, not mandatory, has nothing to do with iOS. It's just a data file that we've put into your project and wrote a little code to read it and use it every time you tap a button. That's kind of the approach. So where can this...
But on the case of the ship menu that he was talking about, well, the ship menu, you were able to design the .ship files, right?
The nib file.
The nib file, yeah. Yeah, well, there's no way, is there another way to do it, to use a lot of the ship menus plugins? Otherwise than duplicating it? Because how would you know which one to read?
That plugin could
Which
be a
nib file to read?
You can't, the nib menu plugin that was created, so, don't get me wrong, it was one of the first things you ever do when you start messing around with plugins. Everything has to be hard-coded rather than the plugin titles. There was no options to have any image share. So although you're moving the buttons around, and obviously everyone could be different if you wanted the thing, there's no customizability. That's an email that gets pretty done. It's about duplicating the plugins. But that's just about the plugin. The plugin developer might add image changes, because we don't mind being in the same space, do we? We just want to change
you would need different nib files, is that it? You would have one for each?
If the image was to move around, you wanted the button different places, you would need a new nib one. Or you could program it.
But it was able, one plugin would be able to have like 20 nibs or whatever?
You could do.
Okay.
We're going to answer some of your questions.
Okay.
We're going to make one, like make a plugin in 5 minutes, and you're like, wow, I get it now, right? And we're going to try to draw a connection between the UI on the screen and this config data. I think a lot of people really struggle with how that works. It's not that big of a deal, but we'll go through a little step thing about it. So I just wanted to make sure that we all knew, just to kind of summarize, that your project is just an iOS project that happens to use a particular approach, that we centralize all the data into this file. And the biggest benefit, in my opinion, the biggest benefit of that is this thing's now very portable. Super portable. You can take this file and paste it into another app and change just a couple of things and off you go, right? And there's some technical things about how to make that possible, but having all the rules and the instructions in one file really does have some benefits. There's also some drawbacks. Some big drawbacks that are now becoming more and more apparent as we kind of scale and have lots more people using this approach that weren't readily apparent in the early days. And I'll give you an example. How about an app with 30,000 screens in it? But it never occurred to me, as a developer, just like you guys, that somebody would sit at a control panel and make 500 menus with 40 things each. They're copied. It's unbelievable.
That'll be the sniffer key.
And as a programmer, I'm laughing, like, who would do this? Right? But it speaks to someone with a lack of understanding who's found a tool that says, this is awesome, it allows me to do what I want to do, nothing else did, this is magic. And I look at the project, I'm like, oh, this thing is gross. Like, who would make a file that's so big? Because they don't understand that the control panel's basically just making this file. So now they have this big, giant gigabyte config file that won't load, you can't email it, it's ridiculous. It won't, in essence, it won't work because it's just too big, and it's not practical when your app launches to try to load this thing into memory, which is what happens when you have 10,000 screens in the list. It's like, really? But it's their lack of understanding of what's happening that led to that. And it's my lack of understanding that someone would actually spend 9 months typing in the control panel to app, right? So it's unintended consequences.
But even if you did it directly in Xcode, you're
It
saying
would
the
still
big
be that way.
So what would be the alternative?
Well, for that person, you brought up a great point. Without BuzzTouch, if somehow they were copying and pasting their class files, they would have 10,000 of them. I think they would not do that. I think they would realize the ridiculousness of it. Because the fact that they were using Xcode to begin with suggested that they have a little bit of understanding of what's going on because they're seeing it. The control panel abstracts that. And it leads you down kind of a trap sometimes that's not easy to understand.
Would breaking it down into little data rails, would that
I'll tell you
work?
another approach, but what was that?
Would it break, if you would have broken it down into the data there?
Yeah, I'll get right back to you, but you had a question first?
Okay.
A couple of different approaches.
So you talk about keeping the file sizes small.
Right.
Okay.
Ideally.
Yeah, which I agree with.
Small is a relative.
How did you get a 0.2 megabyte app onto the App Store?
How do you not get
Well,
one?
no, because the Jiffy ID app that you
Okay.
have is 0.2 of a megabyte.
Super small.
Yeah, it's tiny.
Yeah. it's got
How
like
do you
4 files
do
in it.
that?
It's magic. That's a whole other topic. That's a whole other topic, but and we can explore the Jiffy ID app, which, by the way, you guys, is the first app I ever made, and it was like
So is it
the
1.2?
13th app in the App Store or something in 2007 and the end of early 2008 when the store first launched. And it was kind of there was no such thing as a QR code, and Jiffy ID was an app where you could type in a PIN number and learn something about something. So you'd put a Jiffy ID sticker on a car or a house or a property or whatever, and you'd put that code in your phone and you'd learn about this thing. Now you take a picture of the QR code, it's the same thing. So if you're asking how small it is, that thing doesn't do anything. It's very, very basic. It's only got a few files in it. It's like 6 graphics and 2 class files, and that doesn't add up to much. Huh?
It calls
Yeah,
home the content.
it's dependent on the network.
The content's
So
not.
the
the
resources
content.
are on the network, not on the app.
Yeah.
So it'll
So
look
your
on
question,
the-
his question is, well, what do you do? Because clearly there are apps that have an extraordinary amount of content in them, or appears to be in them, or that they're fetching or whatever, and the app's not that big of a download. Think Facebook, right? Presumably there's an unlimited amount of information in Facebook, but the app's not. Think about downloading the entirety of Facebook, and right? You couldn't do it. So the app is intelligent enough to know where those resources are, and we like to use the word lazy loading, and it loads that data lazily only when needed. So in this example, if you had an app that had 10,000 menus in it, you probably wouldn't load them all into memory because you loaded them all into this config file, which this thing loads into memory when your app launches, if you knew that that's how it worked. But back to the original point is the person who did that didn't understand what the consequence of this was going to be. So there's a couple of ways you could do it. You could A, have a bunch of config files and make them all smaller. The overall size of the app would still be the same in terms of the download size, but the app wouldn't be loading them all into memory all on launch. It would only load them as needed, right? So there's an approach like that. The more common approach is just to use the internet.
Yeah.
And just take these smaller menu by menu files and put them all on different URLs. You know, menu.1, menu.2, menu.3 on your website or whatever. And then that menu goes and gets its config file only when it loads. And so same thing with maps, same thing with image galleries, anything that uses kind of an array of items. So there's a lot of different strategies that you can take, but ultimately it revolves around understanding what this thing does and understanding the relationship between these instructions and the screen. And people don't generally understand that kind of automatically, right? Because they're generally not programmers. If you're a programmer, you look at this, you're like, oh, I get it. Makes perfect sense. But our audience generally aren't programmers for a while when they've kind of become programmers, right? You're going to say
No, what I'm
something?
saying, I'm not a programmer, but I understand how this works. And I've got an Apple about Portuguese castles.
Okay.
And it's got like 100 menus or
Sure.
whatever. And I like to go to the control panel and see each one individually. Although I understand I probably could do it
Differently?
Yeah, but I
Sure.
just like to have it
you're
individual.
different that way.
You know, it's 'cause I don't see zeros and ones, you know? I just like to visualize the things.
Right. The topic was, he said, the thing that caught my mind is, I like to see or I like to do. We all have a different kind of flow and kind of style that we enjoy. Or
Yeah, it's like the
hate.
HTML doc. You had a plugin that you could just type in and it worked and it turns on to HTML, right?
Yeah.
And I remember that user Fred, and he was just, no, don't use that. It's not working. Just use the HTML. I don't want it. I want to type over there, man. I don't want it. Exactly.
Like people
I
want to
want
be
to see
really
it,
well.
man.
Check this out.
Pissing me off. I no, man.
All I was going to demonstrate to you is this idea of dragging things on the screen like this and using a UI to build a screen for David, that's completely foreign. Like, this makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
So I just want to write the code. And you throw the button on this location on the screen, and I don't do graphic stuff like you might. Right? So
Yeah,
everyone's
exactly. This is
different.
the way I would want to do it.
Everyone's
Definitely.
Exactly. And so this is the way that most tutorials teach you. And there's nothing wrong with this approach.
This is what I see in BuzzTouch, you know? I don't have to extra, just go plug in.
Right. I'm just hammering home the idea that all of us think differently.
Yeah, because it's interesting, most of your plugins don't have
Exactly.
XML files. Yeah.
The plugins that I made, here's how funny this is. You know, a long time ago, the ones that you guys kind of mostly use now, or you see now in your control, I didn't even know what Interface Builder was. I never even looked at it. I'm flipping through the book, and I don't care about that. 2007, you know, seeing how the SDK was going to work, I'm like, screw that part, that's my code. I don't think that way. But there's probably the majority of people who are calling themselves programmers who couldn't possibly write the code to locate that button at this rectangle that automatically rotates and has a green background color without this little tool palette here.
It sounds a bit like the approach Game Summit is.
Yes. Yeah, so there's different approaches. I think the biggest reason that we all like BuzzTouch and we understand its like flexibility and power and all that stuff is because we embrace that idea. We're not all doing the same thing. We're not all doing it the same way. We all have different motives and all have different approaches and all have ultimately a different goal for what we're trying to make.
I don't know if
So-
this is the right time,
Uh-huh.
but while we were talking about buttons, how do you make buttons that connect directly to, say, the Scringo screen?
Oh, yeah. I could pull them in, but that's
Yeah.
all I could do.
So how do you make a button in a plugin? So say it was like menu buttons or menu list or
see my menu?
Hit's carousel, and then it goes directly to, say, the quizzes.
Loads
in
another screen.
Scringo quizzes, yeah. Because obviously it's easy to do, we all know how to do it within BuzzTouch, but how do you get it to go to the Scringo quizzes?
That's a great question. Write it down and we'll see if we get to maybe in, I mean, I can
I've
sit up here
already
and
read it
code all
down.
day long. I love that stuff. I just
Yeah.
don't want to bore you guys, but we'll get to that. In fact, we'll leave this as an example, and I'll try to connect this very odd UI in my mind to code, because obviously you can do it, but this is just foreign to me and janky and weird, just like an editor for HTML is.
Yeah.
Right? I write HTML in HTML.
Yeah.
I don't drag from a little palette of widget. That just is crazy to me.
No,
And I look at the HTML result from dragging it on there, I'm like, that's not how you write it, that syntax is broken, I fixed
Yeah,
it.
no, it's like
Who wrote this?
the ship manual. I was working on a nib and I deleted. I just wanted like 4 buttons, and I deleted all the other ones, and I pulled
Right.
it. And then I remember, oh my god, I'm on 5. You know, oh shit. I don't know how to do it again. I have to do it from the beginning, you know.
So let me go back to this point I was trying to get
Delete and start over again.
I just wanted to show you guys who weren't in the meeting the other day that this is your screen today. Now, whether you're self-hosted or on BuzzTouch.com, the idea is the same, right? You've got a list of screens, and you click on a screen to manage its properties, right? So you've got a menu with child items and all the stuff. So in the new control panel, which is, you know, doing well in terms of development or whatever, we had to change a lot about how the control panel works to support this new self-serve plugin market. And I won't get into the reasons why we had to do it, but I want to show you some things that are kind of different about it. So this is the new screens management thing, and you'll notice a little icon down here on the bottom right of that screen icon, and if you go to list view, you're going to get the same thing on the left. So the idea now is, if you want, when you're working directly from the screens page, you can just manually adjust this XML or this config data right here. Just manually type it in there and hit save, and then close. So you don't have to leave. You don't have to leave this screen to make simple modifications
At the WWDC.
to the JSON data.
Is that going to be the normal?
Yeah. And then when you're on the regular page, you can also make changes down here. Just raw. See this 1 right here? Watch that change when I make a choice up here. It'll change to 0.
You gotta say.
Right. See that change to 0?
Yeah.
I change this to 1. So this is the raw representation of all of your choices on the screen. Alternatively, you could copy this and make the change down here and hit save, and this will match.